I wasn't supposed to see the email. It wasn't dramatic or suspicious at first glance, just a subject line sitting quietly at the top of his inbox while he was in the shower, something bland and professional looking, the kind of thing most people would ignore. But what made my stomach tighten was the name, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was too familiar, someone I knew well enough to recognize instantly, someone who had been around us for years. Someone who smiled at me like we shared the same reality. I didn't open it right away. That pause mattered, because part of me still wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, that I was misreading something harmless, that trust meant giving him the benefit of the doubt, but curiosity won, not out of jealousy, but out of instinct. The quiet kind that doesn't scream danger but whispers it just loud enough to make you listen. The email wasn't romantic, not openly, not obviously, and that's what made it worse. It was detailed, familiar, comfortable in a way that only comes from repetition, references to conversations I'd never been part of, inside jokes that landed too easily, plans that assumed availability without asking, and a tone that didn't feel like someone reaching out, but someone continuing something already in motion. And as I scrolled, I realized this wasn't a beginning, it was a middle. By the time he came back into the room, towel around his waist, hair still wet, I had already closed the laptop, already rearranged my face into something neutral, something unremarkable, because whatever this was, I knew confronting him immediately would only give me the version of the truth he was prepared to offer, and I didn't want a story yet. I wanted context. So I said nothing, listened as he talked about his day, watched how relaxed he seemed, how unaware, how secure in the belief that his worlds were separate, and that confidence told me more than any confession ever could. Because people who think they're hiding something well don't guard themselves, they move freely, carelessly, assuming no one is paying attention. I paid attention to everything. The way he checked his phone and tilted it slightly away, the way certain names came up more often than they used to, the way his schedule suddenly had gaps that didn't exist before, and none of it was enough on its own. But together it formed a pattern that didn't need confirmation to feel real. That night, lying next to him, listening to his breathing even out as he fell asleep, I understood something clearly for the first time. Whatever was happening wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a mistake. And it definitely wasn't new. It had been built quietly, piece by piece. In moments I trusted him to be exactly where he said he was, and the realization didn't make me angry or sad right away, it made me focused. Because when you realize you've been living inside someone else's carefully edited version of reality, the first thing you need to do isn't react. It's observe. I didn't change my behavior after that night, because change would have alerted him, and I needed him exactly as he was, comfortable, careless, convinced that whatever he was managing on the side remained invisible, so I stayed consistent. Affectionate in the same way, present in the same rhythms, listening more than speaking, because the easiest way to learn the truth about someone is to let them believe you already know nothing. What became clear quickly was that this wasn't about secrecy, it was about coordination. The way his days adjusted subtly around messages he claimed were work, the way he stepped outside to take calls he used to answer in front of me. The way certain evenings were suddenly non-negotiable, framed as obligations rather than choices, and none of it raised alarms on its own, but together it painted a picture of someone maintaining a parallel timeline. I began noticing how often her name appeared without context, slipped into conversations like background noise, as if repetition could make her presence feel normal, harmless, expected, and I watched how his tone softened when he spoke about her. Not affectionate exactly, but familiar, like someone describing a place they visited often enough to stop explaining it, and that familiarity hurt more than any explicit betrayal could have. What unsettled me most was how practiced he seemed at dividing himself, how easily he shifted roles depending on who he was speaking to, how natural it felt for him to be two versions of the same person without hesitation. And I wondered how long he'd been rehearsing this skill, how many truths he'd learned to withhold long before I ever suspected a thing. I started documenting without urgency, not obsessively, just carefully, dates, times, phrases repeated too often to be coincidence, not because I planned to use them against him, but because I needed to anchor myself in facts. To protect my perception from being slowly rewritten by explanations and reassurances, because when trust erodes quietly, doubt can feel like paranoia if you don't ground it in something real. He noticed my attention in small ways, not as suspicion, but as presence, commenting that I seemed more observant lately, laughing it off like a compliment, and I smiled back, letting him believe he'd identified the change correctly. Because the truth was I wasn't watching him out of insecurity anymore, I was watching him out of clarity. The longer I stayed silent, the more confident he became, volunteering information I hadn't asked for, explaining absences before I questioned them, filling in gaps preemptively. And people only do that when they're managing a narrative they don't fully trust to hold on its own, and every explanation he offered without being prompted told me exactly how fragile that narrative really was. By the end of the week, I no longer needed to search for proof. I had something more valuable: understanding. Understanding that whatever was happening had been designed to rely on my assumption of honesty, on my willingness to accept what I was told without cross-checking it, and once that assumption disappeared, the entire structure felt unstable, even if he couldn't sense it yet. I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I was alert. And that awareness shifted everything, because from that point on, I wasn't reacting to his choices anymore, I was anticipating them, moving ahead of his explanations, quietly stepping into a position where the truth didn't need to be forced out. It just needed time to surface on its own. Once I stopped questioning myself, the story around me started to unravel in ways I couldn't ignore, not through dramatic revelations, but through consistency, the kind that exposes itself when you stop filling in the blanks for someone else. And I realized how often I had been smoothing over gaps without realizing it, turning his vagueness into coherence, his excuses into logic, his absence into patience. I tested nothing directly, didn't set traps or ask leading questions. I simply adjusted my availability, made my schedule less predictable, stopped centering my time around his, and the reaction was immediate, subtle but telling. His check-ins became more frequent, his curiosity sharpened, his tone shifting from casual to careful, because people who rely on control notice quickly when it starts slipping. He asked where I was more often, who I was with, how long I'd be gone, not accusing, just interested enough to feel invasive, and I answered honestly but incompletely, mirroring the same level of access he'd been giving me for months. And watching him struggle with that balance confirmed something important. He wasn't worried about losing me emotionally, he was worried about losing his advantage. Her presence became harder for him to manage the longer I stayed disengaged, small inconsistencies creeping into his stories, timelines overlapping when they shouldn't, details shifting slightly depending on the day. And I didn't correct him or challenge anything, because lies don't need opposition to collapse, they need space, and I was giving him plenty of it. At one point he mentioned a conversation we'd supposedly had, something we had never discussed, and when I gently questioned it, not confrontationally, just enough to create uncertainty, he backtracked so quickly it was almost reflexive. Rewriting the memory in real time, and the speed of that adjustment told me how practiced he was at doing it, how often he'd reshaped reality to fit whatever version of himself he needed to present. I began noticing how exhausted he seemed, not from work, but from maintenance, from keeping stories aligned, from remembering who knew what and when, and that exhaustion made him careless, slipping details without realizing it. Assuming I was still tracking his life the way I used to, unaware that I'd stepped out of that role entirely. What surprised me most was how little effort it took on my part to change the dynamic, how simply removing my emotional labor from the equation forced him to carry the weight of his own deception, and without my support, it started to bend under pressure. Because lies thrive on participation, and I had quietly withdrawn mine. By then, the question wasn't whether he was being unfaithful. It was how long he'd expected to get away with it. And more importantly, what he would do when he realized the person he'd been relying on to keep the peace was no longer invested in protecting the version of reality he'd created. Because whatever came next wasn't going to be about confrontation or proof. It was going to be about choice. Mine. The shift became undeniable the moment he realized I wasn't chasing clarity anymore, because clarity had always been my role, the one who asked, who checked in, who made sense of things when they felt off, and without that role in place, he seemed disoriented. Like an actor missing his cues, unsure when to speak, when to reassure, when to perform. He started over-explaining small things, details I hadn't asked for, stories that arrived pre-packaged with justifications, and I listened without interrupting, letting him talk himself into corners he didn't realize he was building. Because people reveal the most when they're trying to convince themselves they're still believable. What stood out wasn't what he said, but how he watched me while saying it, eyes scanning my face for reactions that never came, pauses lingering too long when I didn't nod or question or soften the moment, and I could feel his unease growing. Because silence had stopped being neutral and started becoming threatening. At the same time, her presence became louder without being visible, referenced indirectly through shared schedules, overlapping commitments, inside knowledge he shouldn't have had, and I realized how much of his confidence depended on my ignorance. How easily he'd grown used to moving freely between worlds as long as neither questioned the other. I began reclaiming space without announcing it, making decisions without consulting him, prioritizing my time in ways that didn't include explanation, and each small boundary landed heavier than any accusation ever could. Because it challenged the assumption that I was still operating from the same emotional position, still waiting for his version of events to guide mine. He tested me then, pushing lightly at first, a sarcastic comment here, a subtle jab there, hoping to provoke a reaction he could use to reset the dynamic, but I stayed even, uninterested, present without being engaged. And the lack of friction unsettled him more than conflict ever would have. One night he asked directly if something was wrong. Not with concern, but with calculation. I met his eyes and told him I was fine, and for the first time, the word didn't land the way it used to, because fine had stopped meaning patient, forgiving, accommodating, and had started meaning finished, even if he couldn't decode it yet. He pressed a little harder after that, asking if I trusted him, framing it like reassurance, and I realized then how fragile his sense of control had become, how much he needed my belief to stabilize the version of himself he was juggling. And instead of answering, I simply said I trusted myself. The room went quiet. That silence wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive, because something shifted in him at that moment, an understanding, not of what I knew, but of what I no longer needed. And when someone realizes they can't manage your perception anymore, they don't double down on honesty. They panic. And I could feel it starting to surface, slow at first, then sharper, because whatever he thought he was hiding so well was no longer protected by my participation, and without that, the truth didn't need exposure. It only needed time. His panic didn't show up as guilt, it showed up as urgency, the sudden need to lock things down, to reassert routines, to pull me back into predictable patterns where he felt safest, and I watched him try to recreate closeness without addressing distance, leaning on habits instead of honesty, because habits are easier to fake. He started planning things out loud, trips we hadn't discussed, future moments framed as assumptions rather than invitations, speaking as if momentum itself could carry us forward, and I let him talk, nodding where it didn't cost me anything. Because the more he projected certainty, the more obvious it became how unsure he really was. What changed was the way he reacted when those plans didn't land. When I didn't mirror his excitement, didn't ask follow-up questions, didn't anchor myself to the future he was sketching, his frustration slipped through, quick flashes of irritation he struggled to hide, moments where his tone sharpened before he caught himself. Because people who depend on control feel threatened by indifference. He began monitoring me more closely then, not overtly, but persistently, checking in under the guise of care, tracking my movements with casual questions, wanting reassurance disguised as curiosity, and I answered plainly, truthfully. But without detail, giving him facts without access, and that imbalance unsettled him, because it mirrored exactly what he'd been doing to me. At one point, he accused me of being distant. Not angrily, not directly, but carefully, like he was testing a diagnosis, hoping I'd either deny it or explain myself back into compliance, and I didn't argue or justify or defend. I simply agreed that I'd been focusing on myself more lately, and the lack of resistance threw him off balance completely. That was when he tried warmth. Unexpected affection, compliments out of nowhere, sudden attentiveness meant to soften whatever wall he sensed had gone up, and I accepted it without leaning into it, because affection used as a strategy feels different when you're no longer starved for it. And I could tell he felt the shift, the way his gestures no longer landed with the same effect. Behind all of it, I could feel him rushing something internally. A need to stabilize before something slipped too far, and I understood then that he knew, not what I knew, but that I was no longer waiting for answers, no longer invested in explanations. And that terrified him more than confrontation ever could. Because confrontation gives you a chance to negotiate. Detachment doesn't. And the more he tried to pull me back into the story he was controlling, the clearer it became that the ending he expected was no longer possible, not because I'd decided to punish him, but because I'd stopped centering my life around someone who was quietly managing versions of himself, depending on who was watching. Whatever came next wasn't going to be loud, but it was going to be final. The breaking point didn't arrive with an argument, it arrived with a realization on his side that something fundamental had shifted and wasn't coming back, and once that awareness settled in, his behavior changed from calculated to reactive. Like someone scrambling to secure a door after realizing the lock had already been removed. He started reaching for reassurance in ways that felt unfamiliar, asking questions he'd never asked before, not about my feelings, but about my intentions, where I saw myself, what I wanted next, whether I was happy. And each question carried an unspoken urgency, as if the right answers might still anchor him to a future he felt slipping out of reach. I didn't lie. I just didn't perform. I spoke honestly, calmly, without cushioning my words or shaping them to protect his comfort, and that neutrality rattled him more than anger ever would have, because anger still signals attachment, still suggests investment. And what he was facing now was the absence of that signal altogether. The messages started piling up when we weren't together, check-ins that didn't require responses but clearly expected them, calls placed too close together to be coincidence. And I noticed how his confidence dissolved the longer I didn't meet that urgency with equal energy, because urgency only works when someone else agrees to match it. At one point, he tried to flip the script, suggesting we were drifting apart, as if it were mutual, as if this were something happening to us rather than something he'd been managing alone for months, and I didn't correct him. Because sometimes letting someone believe their own version is the fastest way to see how fragile it really is. He spoke about trust then, about communication, about effort, using the language of responsibility without taking any of it on himself, and I realized how practiced he was at discussing values he wasn't actually living. How easy it was for him to speak about honesty while actively avoiding it. What he didn't know was that I had already detached emotionally, that the weight he felt wasn't confusion or uncertainty, but the absence of my participation, and once that was gone, there was nothing left to negotiate. No version of events that could bring me back into alignment with a reality that had been quietly manipulated behind my back. By then, his panic had shifted into something quieter, a kind of resignation he didn't yet have words for, moments where he'd fall silent mid-conversation, as if realizing in real time that the leverage he once had no longer existed. And watching that happen didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel free. Because the moment you stop needing explanations from someone who's been withholding them, you stop being part of their strategy altogether, and whatever ending he was bracing for, whatever story he was preparing to tell himself or others, it no longer included me in the way he'd planned. And that was the point where I knew the end wasn't approaching. It had already arrived. I didn't announce the ending, because endings don't need speeches when the decision has already been made internally, and by the time he sensed something final in my calm, it was too late to reframe anything, too late to regain the version of me that used to wait, explain, or hope he'd choose differently. He tried once more, not with promises, not with affection, but with vulnerability, presenting himself as misunderstood, overwhelmed, stretched too thin by expectations, and I listened the same way I had been listening for weeks, attentively but without attachment, because vulnerability used as a last move still carries intention, and I wasn't interested in deciphering it anymore. When he finally asked what I wanted, not defensively, but quietly, I understood how unfamiliar that question was to him, how rarely he'd considered it without first calculating how it affected his control. And I told him the truth without dressing it up, that I wanted peace, clarity, and a life that didn't require me to decode someone else's behavior just to feel secure. He didn't argue. That was the moment that confirmed everything. Because arguments are for people who believe there's still something to win, and he knew then that whatever leverage he'd been holding onto was gone, not taken from him, but released by me, and the absence of resistance left him with nothing to push against. The days that followed were quiet, not awkward, not dramatic, just empty of the tension that had once filled every interaction, and in that quiet, I noticed how light everything felt. How much energy I'd been spending carrying questions that were never meant to be answered honestly. He reached out later, not immediately, with messages that circled around accountability without ever landing on it, looking for reassurance, for absolution, for something to soften the narrative he was already preparing, and I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because silence had become my most honest answer. What I understood then was simple. The betrayal wasn't just in what he hid, it was in how confidently he assumed I would continue to accept less than the truth, and walking away wasn't an act of revenge or self-righteousness, it was a correction. A refusal to live inside a version of reality that required my silence to function. I didn't need closure from him. I had already given it to myself. And whatever story he tells now, whatever explanations he offers to justify what he couldn't maintain, they exist without me, because the moment I stopped participating, his version of events lost its most important witness. Me. I thought distance would quiet everything, but distance has a way of making unresolved people louder, and once he realized silence wasn't pulling me back, his attempts shifted from subtle to obvious, messages no longer careful but emotional, swinging between regret, nostalgia, and self-pity, each one trying a different angle, as if the right tone might reopen a door I had already closed in my mind. He started rewriting history, reminding me of what we had, selectively highlighting moments of closeness, while skipping over the months of half-truths and divided attention, and reading those messages felt strange, not painful, just detached. Like watching someone describe a relationship I'd already outgrown, a version of myself that no longer existed. What surprised me was how quickly he positioned himself as the one who'd been abandoned, telling mutual friends he was blindsided, that he didn't understand what went wrong, and I recognized the pattern immediately. Because people who avoid accountability often rush to control the aftermath, shaping the story before anyone can question it. I didn't correct him. I didn't defend myself. I let the truth stand on its own, because truth doesn't need urgency, and I trusted that anyone who really knew me would sense the difference between disappearance and self-preservation, between silence and guilt. Then the messages changed again. This time they were softer, almost reflective, acknowledging mistakes without naming them, expressing growth without evidence, hinting at change without committing to it, and that was when I knew he was running out of strategies. Cycling through emotional tools that had worked before, unaware that they only worked on someone still hoping. I noticed something else too, something unexpected. I wasn't tempted. Not by his apologies, not by his memories, not even by the familiarity of what we used to be, and that clarity felt like crossing a line you can't step back over, the point where love turns into understanding. And understanding removes the illusion that things could ever return to what they were. He asked once if we could talk for closure. I didn't respond. Because closure offered by the person who caused the confusion is rarely closure at all. It's just another attempt to manage the ending, and I was no longer interested in giving him a role in how my story concluded. By then, the distance wasn't just physical or emotional. It was permanent. And what I didn't realize yet was that this wasn't the end of his involvement. It was the beginning of consequences he hadn't anticipated. The consequences didn't arrive dramatically. They unfolded quietly, through other people, through moments I wasn't even present for, and that was the part he couldn't control, because once a story leaves your hands, it starts telling itself in ways you never intended. I began hearing things indirectly, not gossip, just observations, comments from people who'd noticed patterns they hadn't questioned before, how his timelines never quite matched, how his explanations shifted depending on the audience, how quickly he'd replaced concern with charm whenever something felt off, and I realized that my silence had done more than any confrontation ever could. Without me there to absorb the confusion, it spilled outward. People started asking him questions I had stopped asking months ago, and he wasn't prepared for that, because he'd built his confidence on the assumption that I was the only one paying close attention, the only one connecting dots. And once others began doing it too, the cracks became impossible to ignore. He reached out again, not to reconcile, but to warn me, framing it as concern, telling me people were talking, that narratives were forming, that things were being misunderstood, and I could hear the panic underneath. Because what he was really saying was that he'd lost control of the version of events he'd been carefully maintaining. I didn't reassure him. I didn't deny anything. I simply told him I wasn't involved anymore, and that statement landed harder than anything else I could have said, because it meant whatever was happening now was happening without my influence, without my protection, without the buffer I'd unknowingly provided for so long. What struck me most was how quickly he tried to reframe himself as a victim of circumstances, as someone misunderstood, overwhelmed, unfairly judged, and it confirmed what I already knew, that accountability had never been part of his plan. Only damage control. Meanwhile, my own life was settling into something steadier, quieter, not perfect, but honest, and that contrast made his chaos feel distant, irrelevant, like noise from another room I no longer occupied. I saw him once, unexpectedly, not in a dramatic setting, just passing by, and the look he gave me wasn't anger or longing, it was uncertainty, the kind that comes from realizing the person who knew you best no longer sees you at all. And I understood then how deeply that unsettled him. Because being unseen is terrifying for someone who's always relied on perception to survive. I walked past without stopping. Not because I was strong, but because I was done. And whatever fallout was still unfolding behind me, it no longer had anything to do with the life I was choosing to build. The last piece hadn't fallen yet, but it was close. The final piece didn't come from him at all. It came from the quiet certainty that settled in once everything else had faded, the messages, the speculation, the emotional noise, leaving behind a clarity that felt earned rather than forced. The kind that doesn't need validation to stay intact. I realized then that the most important shift hadn't been the ending of the relationship, but the ending of my role within it, the part of me that used to overextend, to explain, to carry emotional weight that was never reciprocated. And stepping out of that role changed everything more than leaving ever could. Nothing dramatic followed. No grand apology. No public reckoning. Just distance solidifying into permanence, routines reshaping themselves without him, and a growing sense of alignment between how I lived and how I felt, something I hadn't experienced in a long time without even realizing it was missing. I stopped checking for his name in my notifications, stopped wondering how he was framing the story now, stopped caring who believed which version, because peace has a way of shrinking the importance of things that once felt consuming. What stayed with me wasn't bitterness or triumph. It was understanding. Understanding how easily silence can be mistaken for consent, how often people rely on others to hold their integrity in place for them, and how powerful it is to withdraw that support when it's no longer deserved. I didn't walk away to punish him. I walked away to choose myself, and that choice didn't require witnesses or explanations. It only required consistency, something I gave myself every day after. If there's an ending to this story, it's not about him learning a lesson or facing consequences, because those things belong to his journey, not mine. The ending is simpler. I trusted myself. I listened when something felt wrong. And I chose not to stay in a story that needed my silence to survive. That's not closure. That's freedom.